Hi, class. So we left off at culture lag. So I'm going to move into cultural imperialism. Again, you watching this video indicates the fact that I am up in Sacramento at that policy meeting I was telling you about, and we're not actually physically in class. I'm going to attach the link to the Canvas page, and this is probably where you're watching it from. So cultural imperialism is basically an imposition of cultural values on another culture. And sometimes this could be more forceful, sometimes this could be more subliminal. One way that currently I would say cultural imperialism happens, especially at the American kind of level, is entertainment, right? We ship our entertainment around the world. It's not like super imposed in that they are demanding the material, they want to watch it. So, but it is essentially showing them our values and possibly shifting theirs a little bit. High culture is culture patterns of social elite. So it's basically looking at the elite class and focusing in on that group. So sociologists are very much concerned with the elite class as well. Mores are moral views and principles of a group. So essentially it's like norms, which are norming of society or kind of the general conglomerate of how people are behaving. Mores are associated with more the moral norms that are going on in society. All right, language and symbols. Sociolinguistics is how language is changed by culture. So culture shifts language. I think in terms of an example, probably slang is probably the best one. Like texting didn't exist in 1992. Nobody would have known what you were saying if you said it back then. Currently, everybody knows and can form kind of the conceptual version of what texting is. So that is society changing language due to some kind of shift in the environment and or technology. Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is very much that language determines thought. So a lot of times, cultural anthropologists and linguists are moving into different culture groups and even looking at what it is in people's language that maybe is causing or functioning some other avenue of that society. For instance, in traditional Japanese culture and language, they didn't have the word for romantic love. The closest thing you could get to that was duty and obligation. So those are very different reasons to get married, right? In America, romantic love is very prized to the point where rom-coms are very popular movies. And in Japan, love itself is not conceptually built around language. Therefore, people can't conceive what romantic love actually is. Now, the West has influenced that a little bit. Anthropologists are kind of have gone back to look to see if Japanese are now utilizing romantic love, and they found that they still are not to the degree that we are, right? So again, language determines thought, which determines behavior. That Sapir-Whorf hypothesis is super vital within looking at language. Symbols can be things like gestures, hand movements, bowing, shaking hands, those kinds of things. So body symbols, body language, tattoos, body art, all that stuff falls under this as well. Culture change and theories, these are vastly important when we're looking at kind of what it is in society that causes change. And the first thing that we need to talk about is diffusion. Diffusion is that another group is influencing another group based usually on things like trade. And that trade could be symbolic goods like telling of stories, or it could be real goods like transferring seeds for corn. And that's essentially how corn worked its way up from Mesoamerica all the way up to New York and all the way down to the Inca in Peru, is through diffusion. So through kind of these contact areas, cultural peripheries or peripheral zones, diffusion occurs, and it's where people are interacting, and then obviously those shifts can happen. And they're not like overly intentional trying to change people. It's through kind of natural interactions. The other way of culture change is through discovery and innovations or inventions, right? So two ways of culture change, essentially. One's diffusion. Some other group gives you something, teaches you something, shares knowledge, or now gives you a new technology. Like, hey, here's a bow and arrow. Try this out. The other version is that your group discovers or invents something on its own, independent. right? And that's an innovation or an invention or a discovery. So essentially, those are the two ways of culture change. Knowledge transfer, I talked a little bit on the first day. Again, this is simply transferring knowledge. I guess the interesting part here is that it's not information transfer. In essence, basically, I could give you information, which I am right now. Knowledge is a little bit different. It's kind of the idea of talking about fishing and then teaching somebody how to fish, right? So I may be giving you information right now, but what I'm trying to do is create a knowledge structure around being a sociologist, right? Which would be knowledge, and that is how to do something. And even answers all those question words, right? Like, why are we doing that? Why do we need it? And then what are the practices? Where is it appropriate? All of those kinds of big question words, right? Like the why and the how are really kind of the big ones, right? Ideal culture is one of those things. We end up having kind of ideal societies, ideal cultures, which is ideal. We have ideal people, ideal, even like idols comes from ideal, really. So we get into kind of the idea of what is our ideal culture in society. And a lot of us think there are problems with the current one, so how can we fix it, right? So fixing it would entail that we create some version of our own utopia. Real culture is more what is actually happening. And some elements of that are things like social control. We'll really get into social control and deviancy and some of those other things. How is it that society is controlling itself and its members? Counterculture is something that is opposed to the general kind of cultural rule. And it can also refer to kind of 1960s when large swaths of young people started to rebel against the establishment. And really that just is a term that is associated with that group, but counterculture is basically anytime anybody goes against the group norms. And social control, back to social control a little bit, I would say that counterculture, what happened was the social controls that are involved are not necessarily so intact within America that the counterculture could not exist and could not take place. So some interesting stuff there. Globalization, you guys have probably heard the term so many times. It's essentially the expansion of goods, trades, symbolic goods, everything kind of to the different ends of the world, and a connectivity really is what we're looking at there. Functionalism, cohesive elements of society that function. Again, I've kind of gone through this already. This would be Durkheim, looking at what is it, how are people being brought together. And actually social control could be one of those things of functionalism, right? So if we have obeying speed laws and some of those other things, then we're all doing the same thing. We're norming society. So that would be a functionalistic kind of control mechanism. Conflict theory, again, is Karl Marx kind of theoretical orientation, which is really society is inherently unequal. It reinforces issues of power and class, and material culture affects society, essentially economic determinism to a degree in terms of like work. Marx was very focused on work and unequal distribution of resources. Symbolic interactionism, again, is concerned with the face-to-face interactions between members of society. We get Irving Goffman, who really gets into kind of the symbolic interactions and strategic interactions and framing and frame theory and some of these other things, which is how is it that individuals communicate and move back and forth. And a lot of times those are culturally, societally determined. So a lot of his theories don't necessarily work in other cultures that don't have the same value structure. All right, so I'm going to run through day 4, and I'll probably go fairly quickly. And when we get back to class on next Tuesday, I will probably run through these at least at a speedy pace because you will have access to this link, essentially. So if you need to go back, it will exist. But I do want to run through some of this stuff, and some of this stuff will kind of come up again. Again, it's not just sociology, but it is definitely moving back into that kind of history mind, and then in prehistory and more anthropological, but really looking at how groups and how people subsisted, lived, and then their political economies. How do they organize themselves in terms of their politics? socio-political economy really is kind of the three branches that we cover here. So the ones that we're going to talk about today are hunter-gatherers, foragers and scavengers, pastoral societies, horticulture, agriculture, and then the information digital societies. I think that this is important to go through because we're going to end up spending the rest of the semester really talking about modern society, but I think that it's important to know where we all came from in terms of a societal structure, cultural structure, so that we know and we're a little bit more informed in the realm of why is it that we're doing what we're doing, how is it that we're organized, what is, and then this kind of exercise will also probably inform a little bit more about functionalism, conflict theory, and so symbolic interactionism as well. So bands are smaller groups of people, usually 30 to 100 to 300 members. That's basically max. Essentially, people were organized by kinship, so a lot of people were related, cousins, those kinds of things, and really had a kind of interesting organization structure, which is they were egalitarian, not hierarchical, so no one person had power. There was no leader. In this grouping, there was no chief, there was no headman, there was no big man, there was no king, there was no president. Every adult had a voting right and or a right to voice their concerns and comments, and also an equal proportion of decision-making power. And this is hard probably for us to understand a little bit because we don't operate a lot of times in egalitarian roles. There are some, and I would say that the egalitarian roles start to really come out when we move into friendship, right? Because we're not necessarily hanging out with our parental figures, which absolutely have kind of a certain level of power over us. So when we move into that, teenage years and even kind of in our upper teens and 20s, hanging out with friends is more of an equal kind of footing. And I think that this is maybe even the enticement and or the kind of the impetus to why we actually switch out our friends for our parents, is that actually we as individuals crave more of an egalitarian kind of lifestyle, which is part of us, because for 250,000 years, humans really organized themselves in this way. And the reason why I put 2 million years ago is if we go back to our furthest hominid relatives in the Homo genus, right? So we're talking about Homo habilis and Homo erectus here. It's 2 million years ago. 250,000 is when kind of the human species breaks and kind of is formed as its own. And up till 10,000 years ago, we basically ordered ourselves this way. In these egalitarian groups. Individuals step up for certain jobs. It's talent-based. So again, if you're really good at making houses, that's what you're going to do. If you're good at hunting, that's what the group's going to have you do. If you're a horrible shot with a bow and arrow, the group is not going to have you keep going out trying to hunt a deer. That makes zero sense. So talent is definitely a big part of how these people organized. Decisions, again, are made collectively, most of the time through consensus, sometimes through voting. Laws were governed by cultural norms and taboo. So this would have been based on behavior. This would not have been based on all right. So what else? So cultural norms is how people operated. There were no written laws because they didn't write anything down. People would have learned rules and how society was structured through observation. So kids essentially, again, hung out with their parents when they were young. They did what the parents did. They tried to imitate the parents. There's not a lot of rebellion or distrust. There's a lot of trust within these groups because you have a bunch of parental and or adult figures around you all the time. There's not many surviving band level cultures left today. The question is why not? Obviously, civilization and our large kind of ordered societies in our colonial imperialistic ways kind of either forced bands into our own or destroyed them, right? Not super uplifting at this point, but definitely looking back at kind of how people organized for 250,000 years, and this was the most common way throughout history.